Secretary Lehman.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you all to focus on just one overarching. There. I'd like to ask you all to focus on just one overarching set of issues in framing the questions I'm going to ask, and that is the genetic or cultural issue that underlies this debate about whether FBI should be the domestic intelligence agency. What is the problem we're talking about? Well, sharing is certainly one manifestation of that. One very senior intelligence official has told us that he did not learn about the connections of three of the principal actors in the '93 bombing on the World Trade Center until years after, when the trial was finally finished and they released the grand jury evidence. We had this morning the former deputy attorney general tell us that one of his proudest accomplishments was his 6th August 2001 memo notifying the FBI that they must bring in the prosecutors immediately when they're beginning a case. Time and time again, we've had witnesses that we've interviewed, including another one this morning, that have said, well, I'd prefer not to answer those questions because this matter is in the grand jury, or this matter is now in litigation. We got that answer time after time in pursuing issues around the Moussaoui case, for instance, but there were many others. Now, that's understandable, perhaps, before 9/11. But after 9/11, one would have expected that that mentality, the prosecutorial, the forensic, rather than the preventive mentality, would have changed. Yet, as late as last June 18th, a witness before the House Appropriations Subcommittee, in explaining how the FBI was pursuing, or thought to be pursuing, the terrorist issue, testified as follows in part: when we do our intelligence in the FBI, it should be forensic intelligence. It should be based on evidence. It should be based on fact. It must bear the scrutiny of law that can be looked at by a jury and a judge. And she went on, we need to know what is reality, what can be proved, and not based on simple assessments and projections. And on, while other recourses may seem expedient, it is only through careful and aggressive casework that we will rid ourselves of the foe and maintain cooperation in the American public. Well, I've never read a more perfect articulation of anti-intelligence work than I could find. It reflects very well why the FBI is the best police force in the world, but it could also suggest that it may be the worst intelligence force in the world, because intelligence is looking forward and sharing and not protecting evidence to get convictions. The situation, or the question I'd like to pose to you assumes certain things. As Mr. MacGaffin has rightly said, the MI5 issue has, I think, been repeatedly dragged out as a red herring, because MI5 is certainly not the alternative here. A far better, a closer potential alternative is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which has many more analogies. And interestingly, reading the debate in the 80s that went on when this was created, the exact same arguments that General Barr has adduced here were made by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and rejected. And I think most observers within the Canadian government believe that real cultural problems were fixed by getting the intelligence function out of out from under the police and the Justice Department, in effect. My distinguished colleague Jamie earlier described very succinctly what the Justice Department has as its mission. Number one, to prosecute criminals and miscreants, and number two, to protect the rights of citizens. Well, both of those things are really at odds all the time and in tension with intelligence collection and analysis. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it is certainly a major tension. Indeed, you can argue that the problems that have been discussed earlier in testimony about the threats to civil liberties by the Patriot Act and by powers before that, and the corollary, the overreaction in bending over backwards, as in the Moussaoui case, not to tread into that territory, is precisely because we try to do two incompatible functions, police work and intelligence, in the same agency. So with that brief preamble, I'd like to ask you all to consider four options. Now, all three of you in one form or another have said that you favor essentially the status quo. More resources, the FBI should run faster, jump higher, do more language training, get better, more intelligent professionals in it, but basically you're all three arguing for the status quo and just make it better. Now, I understand, since all of us have been laboring to acquire these same skills of collegiality, that in your article in The Economist and sitting as you are as a panel, that you don't want to disagree too directly, but I'd like to ask you to sort of leap out of that collegiality in your answers here. First, I see four potential options that I'd like you to comment on. You've already commented on the first option, more resources, to do better, and give them a chance. Give Director Mueller time to do what he has set out to do, and he's made significant changes. That begs the question: how do we know that he's succeeding? Do we have to wait for another 9/11, or in its absence we say he's succeeding? Or are there metrics or measures that we can apply so as not to give this an indefinite tenure until it's proved its failure through another catastrophe? So how about commenting on that? I mean, I suspect there's at least one closet CSIS sympathizer there, but let's see.
You know, I think it's analogous to the MI5. It's been a bad experiment for Canada. They're spending a lot of their time right now trying to patch up that relationship and reintegrate these functions. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have had to create a lot of redundant functionality because of that split up. So I would say that I would not look to the Canadian system as an exemplar. And I think, you know, your litany was really, I think, unfair. First, you talk about the prosecutorial mentality because, in fact, they are prosecuting a case. Well, once a decision is made to prosecute a case, and the Moussaoui case was, that decision was not made just by the Justice Department, it was made by the President to move down that track, then it is a prosecution. And when it is a prosecution, you don't share grand jury information and other things, and that's the law. So it doesn't surprise me that they weren't sharing it with you. That doesn't mean it's not being shared within the executive branch. The examples you gave in the past were precisely the problem as to why we needed the Patriot Act, because of the limitations on grand jury information and because of the limitations on sharing intelligence with law enforcement. And those have been addressed in the Act. This culture thing is way overdone. You know, prior to, as I say, prior to the 70s, the FBI was well into domestic intelligence. They viewed themselves as wearing two hats, national security and law enforcement. The problem with the FBI, if most people would have said then, was they were collecting too much intelligence about domestic matters. They knew too much about civil rights organizations, about anti-war organizations. They had to feel pretty well covered. They knew how to collect information. If you look at certain other of their functions, like organized crime, that's an intelligence effort. That's not rushing in early and prematurely just to prosecute people. They know how to penetrate groups and keep those penetration agents in place for a long time and learn information and take down or build intelligence on organizations and take them down. They've done that in the counter-narcotics area. They've done that in the counter-intelligence area. So this notion that they're just prosecution bent and that's their culture and they can't do anything else is just hogwash. Now, what we've had is a period of time in the 70s, 80s, and 90s where people didn't want them in that field, and they put a lot of restrictions on them. And you ruined your career if you stepped out of line at the FBI and started snooping around domestic matters too much. And now we've had a epiphany since 9/11. We want them to get back into that. That's the real story. Now, you say that these are fundamentally incompatible. That's wrong. They're not incompatible. They are compatible activities. In fact, they have to be carried out together because they both involve collecting information within the United States, and the tools and the resources are the same resources. That's my reaction.
Strong letter to follow.
I certainly can't associate myself with the run faster, jump higher approach, more resources. That's not at all what I'm recommending. I think that's wrong. I think, to go back to a question that was asked of John Hamre, I think time is running out to get this right. I do not believe, and I hope the formal statement I've submitted makes this clear, I don't believe that the changes that are and reforms that are in place are sufficient or adequate to the task. I don't believe they'll get us there. I'm hoping that your efforts and our efforts jointly to focus on this very issue will add to and add an urgency and a significant change, course correction in what Director Mueller and the others are doing. I do not think the path we're on now will get us there because I don't believe it really makes the distinction between gathering and focused collection, which is the heart of it.
The advantage of having Attorney General Barr is he's got the recollection to say what it was like. But, today the FBI cannot rent 5,000 square foot of office space without getting advance permission from the Congress. Operationally, the cultural environment they live in and the oversight they live in, which I think is unproductive, is dramatically constraining their imagination of what they think they can do. And I support wanting to give them the tools of the Patriot Act, and there's great controversy about the Patriot Act. Frankly, what's been accomplished since they got it is modest. And in large measure, it's because of this culture. Granted, they had the history, but this was 25 and 30 years ago. I mean, there are 5 members of Congress that trace themselves back to that history. So, I mean, we really have a very different environment that we're working with now. Again, let me state, I want them to succeed. I want this to work. It isn't that I'm after the status quo, plus this has to change. But I start with a premise of wanting competence under constitutional oversight. And I think the best place to ground that is in the FBI. I'm not confident it's going to work, but I want it to work. I'm hopeful but not optimistic. That's where I am personally. Now, on that mode, let me say, I think that I'm a chief operations kind of guy. I mean, and there are things you could do to help them. This dichotomy between law enforcement and analysis is, I think, false, because intelligence doesn't spring out of just wise people sitting around a room thinking. It really springs out of facts that are presented to people who then integrate it into a framework and then test it against the hypotheses of other people. It really is grounded on collection. And for years, we've not had the capacity to translate cases into intelligence input. And the director is addressing that. We need to start buying the capacity at every field office, people that can take a case and then extract out of it the intelligence that can be used and shared without violating the internal integrity of the case itself. We do that in the military world. We have analytic officers placed at tactical intelligence units, not to report on what's going on with that unit per se, but what are we now seeing about new tactics that are being employed with radars, for example. We need the same kind of skill. But if you look at the grade structure in the FBI, what does it take to become a senior person? You ain't going to make it being an analyst. You'll make it if you get to be a special agent, and you're on a different track. I mean, so you can solve this, but there's some real serious gunsmithing questions internal to the FBI we need to tackle in the process.
Well, I'd like to get each of your comments on the two most prominently discussed alternatives to leaving the function in the FBI. Not the straw men that float around, but the option of taking the organization that has been built and placing it somewhere else. And the two options that have most currency are, and by the way, all of them involve judicial oversight, not letting them run free, but taking them out from under the Attorney General and the executive oversight, which I think is a real failing of the MI5 system, trying to apply it here. But have judicial oversight when they have to go to get, they request a wiretap. It has the same or even stronger protections. Plus, there is not the concern of the police power being co-located with the intelligence analytic and gathering. And the second common thread is that wherever it resides, it would co-locate in the regional offices of the FBI, analogous to the way the CIA operates out of embassies abroad and other cover. So the two options that seem to be most current are to take the current domestic intelligence function from CIA, perhaps from FBI, perhaps augmenting it with some of the other existing, not creating a new organization, but taking the domestic intelligence function and placing it under, number one, the Director of Central Intelligence as one option, or putting it in Homeland Security as another option. So just limiting it to that option of a clearly overseen entity that is co-located with the FBI, has, as General Thompson said, rapid and open communications to prosecutors, but not as subordinates to the prosecutors who decide whether to make it a case and run for Congress or something. This is the option that I'd like you to address. Putting under the DCI, putting it under Department of Homeland Security. General Barr?
I think they're both ridiculous options. Who's going to collect, analysis is centralized, collection is dispersed. You need resources to do it in the United States. It's different collecting intelligence and information you can act upon within the United States than it is in Afghanistan. You need feet on the street. You need the resources and the expertise that already exists in the FBI. And as I said, it seems to me it has to be coordinated with the end game. I'm all for, shooting Hellfire missiles from drones and knocking off people once we, decide we found them in Yemen. We don't do that in the United States. So we need an end game in the United States, and the DCI doesn't have an end game. Putting it over Homeland Security, boggles my mind. I mean, those are law enforcement. Would you rather have the customs culture influence these people? I mean, I don't know, what you accomplish by that, except seemingly taking it out. The object seems to be to remove it from, the law enforcement function, which is collecting a lot of information on its side of the house. In the United States, where do we get the information from, mostly? We actually get it by threatening people with prosecution. A lot of the information that's been developed has been developed by the law enforcement side, by threatening punitive action against people. Okay, now, maybe overseas we catch them in compromising positions and take photographs of them or something like that, but over here we collect information in different ways.